The morning she passed through Suren, I was standing at the upper dock railing watching the river traders come in with the tide. I had not slept well. The eastern tributary had flooded its embankment again, which meant 3 border settlements were underwater, and the grain barges from the Velith cooperatives would be 2 weeks late. My steward had left a stack of petitions on my council table the height of my forearm, and my second-in-command, a broad-shouldered wolf named Darrow, had informed me at dawn that the river gate had jammed overnight and the morning market would open 40 minutes behind schedule. It was, by any measure, an ordinary morning in Valdenmere, the kind of morning that belonged entirely to logistics and the cold press of duty, with no room for anything else. Then the river market opened below me. She came in on one of the small flat-bottomed skiffs that the traveling healers use, the ones that move from delta town to delta town selling dried medicines, river herb bundles, and the quiet practical knowledge that the larger settlements never bother to send south. She was not remarkable to look at if you were not looking. A plain gray cloak over a dark traveling dress, a wicker pack on her back, a basket of bundled herbs balanced in the crook of her left arm. Her hair was pulled back simply. She stepped off the skiff onto the dock without hurrying, without looking around to find an audience, without any of the performance that traders usually made of their arrival at Suren, which was the largest river city in the delta and drew people accordingly. She simply stepped off the boat and walked into the market as though she had somewhere to be. I noticed her the way you notice something that does not fit, not because she was out of place, but because she was, in some way I could not immediately name, entirely correct. As though she belonged here more than the market stalls themselves, as though the dock had been waiting for her to step onto it. Then the mark appeared. I had heard about it. Every alpha king in the Delta Kingdoms grows up hearing about the fated mate mark, the old stories about the wrist burning to life when your destined mate comes into range, the bone-deep pull, the way the wolf inside you goes absolutely still, because it has found the thing it never knew it was looking for. I had heard these stories. I had, by the age of 38, quietly dismissed them. I had governed Valdenmere for 14 years. I had fought 2 border wars, rebuilt the eastern levy twice, lost good wolves and good friends and my father in the same decade. I was not a man who believed that love arrived without warning on an ordinary morning while you were thinking about grain barges. And then the mark appeared on my wrist, and I understood that I had been a fool. It was not a flash of light or a bolt of pain the way the old songs describe it. It was quieter than that and far more absolute. A warmth that started at the inside of my right wrist and spread, not outward, but inward, as though something had always been there, and had simply been waiting for permission to be felt. The shape of it was unlike anything I had seen in the old texts. Not a wolf's head, not a moon symbol, not the crown and claw that my father's generation favored in their stories. It was a river delta pattern, branching lines that looked like tributaries seen from above, the way Valdenmere itself looks from the high ridge on a clear day, as though whoever had drawn it knew something about me. I looked down at my wrist, and then I looked up at the market below. She had already moved 20 stalls into the crowd. I moved fast. I was down the dock stairs in 30 seconds, through the gate arch in 40, into the market crowd in less than a minute. I pushed past traders with rivereel crates and women comparing bolt cloth, and a pair of argument-prone wholesale merchants who had planted themselves directly in the main channel. I was not a small man, and the crowd parted around me out of habit, which helped. The mark on my wrist was warm, not burning, not painful but steady, like a lantern held cupped against the wind. I reached the stall where she had stopped. A drying herb vendor, reeds and rivermint, and some of the flat-leaf plants that grow along the eastern bank. She was examining a bundle of something with the careful attention of a person who actually knew what she was looking for. Her head was bent. I was close enough that I could have spoken. Then someone called my name from the east dock, my harbor master, voice carrying over the crowd with the ease of 20 years of practice, and I turned for half a second, just half, because a ship had come in wrong and was going to clip the reed barge moorings. When I turned back, she was gone. I searched the market for 2 hours. The herb vendor told me she had paid, thanked him briefly, and left, heading back toward the south dock, he thought, but he could not be sure. The south dock led to 6 different departure channels. By the time I reached it, every flat-bottomed skiff that had come in that morning had already gone. I stood on the south dock with the mark burning steady on my wrist and watched the open river. I did not know her name. I did not know her origin. I had no description that would distinguish her from 10,000 other traveling healers in the Delta Kingdoms, except that I had looked at her for 40 seconds across a busy market, and the oldest magic in the wolf bloodlines had said, "Her." I was a methodical man. I had run an army's logistics before I had run a kingdom, and the habits of that life did not leave you: the careful accounting, the patient building of information, the willingness to wait for the right angle before you moved. I applied those habits now. I sent inquiries down every departure channel out of Seren's South Dock. I had my people catalog every traveling healer registered in the Delta system. I sent letters to the River Guild representatives in 7 settlements requesting any record of a lone female healer passing through in the weeks before and after the date in question. 3 weeks later, I had narrowed it to 11 names. 6 months later, 4. Over the next 2 years, through correspondence, through careful border questions, through every resource I could apply without causing alarm or looking like what I was, an alpha king conducting a private search for a woman he had seen for 40 seconds, I brought it to 2. Then, at the end of the 2nd year, to 1. Her name was Lissa. She had come from the upriver settlements originally, daughter of a river herbalist who had died when she was a child, trained in her craft by the guild healers at Pelvin until she was old enough to take her own boat. She had been traveling the Delta circuit for 5 years, appearing in market records in Seren, in Delveth, in the smaller settlements along the south bank, selling medicines and the occasional week of her skilled time to settlements whose permanent healers had died or moved on. She was unclaimed. She had no pack affiliation. In the Delta's official records, she was listed as a traveling independent Omega, which was the guild designation for women who moved freely without pack protection, and which, in practice, meant that the border councils filed her under the category of not our concern. 3 years after the morning on the dock, I finally had a confirmed sighting, a border outpost record from the eastern edge of Valdenmere, 8 days old. She had passed through heading east, toward the Dreven territories. I sent a rider east immediately. The rider came back in 5 days, with news that was not news I had anticipated. She had been taken. The Dreven were not, technically, enemies. They were a rival Delta kingdom, larger than Valdenmere in territory, smaller in the kind of authority that comes from having a functioning legal system, and their relationship with the border agreement that governed interkingdom movement of unclaimed Omegas was the relationship of a man who signs a document he has no intention of honoring. The practice of taking traveling independents who crossed the eastern border without pack escort was not officially sanctioned. It was also not stopped, because the border councils of the Delta kingdoms were composed of men who had decided, somewhere in the comfortable middle of their lives, that outrage was expensive and paperwork was cheap. The Dreven had taken her. That was what my rider brought me. I convened an emergency border council session the following morning. The council met in the long hall above Seren's River Gate, 7 representatives from the Delta kingdoms, including the Dreven envoy, a carefully neutral man named Parath who had been serving in this posting for 6 years, and who had developed over those 6 years a remarkable talent for hearing exactly nothing. I laid out what I knew. A traveling independent Omega, guild registered, had crossed the border 8 days ago and had been detained in the Dreven Eastern compound. I requested formal authorization for a cross-border recovery under the Interkingdom Accord, Section 9, which covered the wrongful detention of free-moving guild members. The council discussed it for 2 hours. They declined to authorize. The Dreven envoy expressed polite regret. The compound in question, he said, was in a jurisdictional gray zone. The woman in question had not been formally registered at the border crossing, which meant that technically, and he used that word with the particular smoothness of a man who had learned that technically was a door that swung in one direction only. Technically, she had entered Dreven territory without documentation, which created a complication with regard to the accord's applicability. The other 5 council members looked at their tables. I looked at Parath for a long moment. He held my gaze with the practiced equanimity of a man who had sat through 30 of these sessions and expected to sit through 30 more. I stood up. "I note the council's position for the record," I said. "I note my objection to it also for the record." Then I left. Darrow caught up to me in the corridor, his long stride matching mine with the ease of a man who had been doing it for 15 years. "You're going yourself," he said. It was not a question. "I'm going tonight," I said. He said nothing for a moment. Then, river or land? River to the eastern break, then land through the marsh. The Dreven Eastern compound is 3 hours on foot from the break if you know the right channel markers. And you know them. I know them. He stopped walking. "Karen." He used my name, which he did only when he was about to say something he considered important. "If the Dreven find you on their ground." "They won't." "But if?" "Then we will have a much larger diplomatic problem than we currently have," I said, "and you will handle it with the council, and I trust you to do so. But Darrow, she's been there 11 days. He was quiet for a moment. He was a good wolf. He understood things without needing them explained. "Take the gray boat," he said. "The river patrols don't check the gray boats." I left at dusk. The Dreven marshlands had a particular character that I had always found instructive. They were difficult terrain if you didn't know them. Reed beds 8 feet high in places, channels that branched and doubled back, soft ground that could swallow a boot hole if you stepped wrong. They were also, because of all of that difficulty, chronically under-patrolled. The Dreven preferred to manage their borders with the assumption that the terrain would do the work for them, which it did, for most people. I had crossed this marsh twice before. Once at 22, on a scouting mission for my father's border campaign that had never escalated to a war. Once at 31, alone, following a lead in an unrelated matter that was now classified and would remain so. Both times I had used the same channel system, a series of markers the old river guilds had left before the Dreven territory was formalized, small carved stones at intervals along the reed bed edges, invisible unless you knew their height and their angle. I pulled the gray boat in silence. The Delta night had the quality it always had this far east, a warm darkness, a little closer than comfortable, the sound of the marsh birds settling in the reeds and the occasional movement of something larger in the deeper channels. The mark on my wrist was steady. It had been steady for 3 years, but now it was something else, directional almost, the way a compass needle differs from ambient warmth. She was ahead of me. That was the only way I could describe it. Not a sensation I could have mapped to any medical explanation, but the bone knowledge of a wolf who had spent 3 years learning the particular frequency of a bond, and now felt it resolve from background noise into signal. I reached the eastern channel break just after midnight, and made the boat fast at the old guild post. The compound was a converted trade house, 3 stories of river brick, built in the old style with narrow windows and a flat roof, set back from the channel on a raised embankment. There were 2 Dreven guards at the main gate, one on the upper walkway, pacing. The windows of the second story were shuttered but showed lamplight at the edges. I had not been a soldier for 20 years, in order to find a lit building with 2 guards difficult. I went in through the roof. The access hatch on the flat roof was old and had not been oiled recently, a failing I appreciated, because the noise of a well-oiled hatch sliding open is audible from farther away than the careful click and hold of a sticky one taken slowly. I was inside in 4 minutes. The upper floor was storage. The second floor was where the lights were. I moved through the corridor carefully. There were 3 rooms on the left side, doors closed. 2 guards stationed at the stairhead, both looking down rather than up, which told me they had not been warned about roof access. I settled behind the storage room doorframe and listened. 3 rooms. I needed to know which one. The mark on my wrist told me. It was not subtle. The warmth had been building since I crossed the marsh, the directional pull growing from suggestion to certainty, and now, standing 10 feet from 3 closed doors in a dark corridor, it was not warmth anymore. It was a point. A specific, unmistakable point, the way a compass needle is not approximate about north. The second room, second door on the left. I waited until the stair guard's attention moved. One of them shifted to speak quietly to the other, both looking down, and I crossed the corridor in 4 steps and opened the second door. The room was small. A single lamp on a wall hook turned low, a sleeping pallet, a small table with a water jug, a window shuttered and latched. She was sitting on the pallet with her knees drawn up and her back against the wall, and she was not asleep. Her eyes came to the door the instant it opened, wary, already positioned to move, not the eyes of someone who had given up, but of someone who had been thinking carefully about options, and had simply not yet found the one that worked. She saw me and went still. I saw her, and the mark on my wrist blazed. It was not metaphorical. It lit, a genuine warmth that I could see even in the low lamplight, a faint amber glow beneath the skin of my inner wrist, the delta branch pattern I had been carrying for 3 years suddenly burning gold in the dark of a Dreven holding room. I had never seen it do that before. For 3 years it had been constant and warm and silent. Now it blazed. She looked at my wrist. Then she looked at her own palm. She turned it up slowly, the way a person does when they're confirming something they have been thinking about for a long time. There was a scar there, not a wound, not damage, but a mark, the same delta branch pattern I wore on my wrist, in the center of her palm where the old texts always placed the mate bond's answering signature. It was glowing too. The same amber, the same quiet fire. She had been carrying it for 3 years without knowing what it was. She looked up at me. I crossed the room in 3 steps and crouched in front of her so that we were level, so that she was not looking up at me, so that the first thing she experienced of me was not my height or my reach or any of the things that would be reasonable to fear in a man who had just come through a locked door in the dark. "My name is Karin Voss," I said quietly. "I'm the Alpha King of Valdenmere. I've been looking for you for 3 years. I know that's an extraordinary thing to say, and I know you have no reason to trust me. But I need you to trust me for approximately 40 minutes, and then I will explain everything, I promise." She looked at me for a long moment. Her gaze was direct, not frightened, which told me a great deal about her. Cautious, measuring, the look of a woman who had been making careful calculations for however many days she had been in this room. Then she looked again at the matching glow between her palm and my wrist. 40 minutes, she said quietly. Or less, I said, if we move now. She stood up without another word, picked up the small pack that had been wedged behind the pallet. Her wicker basket was gone. The traveling dress was worn, but she had kept the pack, and walked to the door as though she had been waiting for a cue, and this was simply it. We went out the window. I had the rope already. She went first. She was light and moved without hesitation, hand over hand down to the embankment, and I followed, drew the rope down after me, and we were on the ground in less than 90 seconds. The guard on the upper walkway was at the far end of his pacing route and not looking our direction. We moved into the reed beds before he turned back. She did not speak for the first 10 minutes, which was the right choice. Sound carried over water in the marsh in ways that were counterintuitive, and the first 10 minutes were the riskiest. She followed my hand signals without explanation, which told me she was either trained in some form of field movement, or she was simply the kind of person who reads a situation and responds accordingly. I suspected the latter. At the boat, I helped her in over the bow. She was already steady on water, the balance of someone who had spent years on flat-bottomed skiffs, and I pushed off from the guild post and got the pole working before I spoke. "Are you hurt?" I said. "No." She was sitting in the prow, one hand steadying against the reed bed, watching the dark channel ahead. "They were holding me for documentation," they said, "to determine whether I had rights of transit." A pause. "I'm a guild-registered independent. I have rights of transit." "You do," I said. "The council declined to enforce them." A silence. "The council," she said, "can decline to whatever it likes. That doesn't mean it's right." "No," I agreed, "it doesn't." She was quiet for a moment. "Then you came anyway." "I came anyway." She turned to look at me from the prow. In the marsh dark I could not read her expression clearly, but the mark on her palm was still glowing, faint now, a residue of that first blazing recognition, and it cast just enough light to see that she was watching me with the same careful directness she had used in the room. "You said 3 years," she said. 3 years. You've been looking for me for 3 years. She said it as a statement, not a question, but with the particular weight of a person confirming something they are still trying to accept the scale of. "The morning you came through Seren's River Market," I said. "You stopped at the drying herb vendor on the East Channel. You were examining flat-leaf bundles. My harbor master called my name. I turned for half a second, and when I turned back you were gone." Another silence, longer this time. "I remember that market," she said quietly. "I remember my palm started burning that day and didn't stop." She looked at her hand. "I thought it was a reaction to something I'd handled. I kept checking for the contact point for weeks." "It was the mate bond," I said. "I know that now," she said. "I didn't know it then. I'd heard about it, the old stories, but I didn't think." She stopped. "You didn't think it applied to you," I said. "I'm an unclaimed traveling independent," she said. "The old stories are about lunas and bloodlines and great halls. They're not about women who sell rivermint at market stalls." "The bond disagrees," I said. She looked at me again. The reed beds parted around the boat and the channel opened into the broader water, and the sky was clearer out here, the marsh stars reflected on the dark surface. The mark on my wrist was warm and steady and absolutely certain. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Back to Seren," I said. "And then, if you're willing, I'd like to have the conversation I should have had 3 years ago on a dock." She was quiet for a long time after that. Not withdrawn, I could feel it, the warmth of the bond making her presence something I was aware of in every direction, not just visually. She was thinking. "All right," she said finally. We reached the channel break just before dawn. I had expected pursuit. I had planned for it, 3 contingencies, each one keyed to a different scenario, depending on how quickly the Dreven discovered her absence, and whether they chose to interpret it as a kingdom-level incident or a quiet administrative problem they would prefer not to formalize. As it happened, they chose the latter, which was the practical choice, and the one I had considered most likely. An Alpha King caught alone on your territory is a significant diplomatic incident. An Alpha King who was never officially on your territory, and whose presence cannot be proven, is not a problem you need to report to anyone. By the time we reached the Valdenmere River break, the eastern sky was pale gray, and the marsh birds were starting their morning noise. Darrow was waiting at the break with 2 horses and a traveling coat, and a face that expressed approximately no surprise whatsoever at my having returned successfully. He looked at Lissa, then at the mark on my wrist, which was still glowing faintly in the early light. He said nothing. He simply handed her the traveling coat. It was cold on the water in the early morning, with the matter-of-fact courtesy of a man who had decided, sometime in the last 12 hours, to accept whatever came next. She took it with a quiet thank you and put it on. "The council has been informed that the Alpha King is returning from an early morning river inspection," Darrow said to me. "Good," I said. "Parath sent a message," he said. "He requests an urgent meeting." He described the matter as requiring immediate clarification. "I imagine it does," I said. "Tell him noon. Tell him to bring the full council." Darrow looked at me, then at Lissa again, then back at me. "The full council," he said. "All 7, I said, "including Parath." He absorbed this. "You're going to make them look at it," he said. "I'm going to make them see what they decided not to see," I said. "Yes." He said nothing for a moment, then very quietly, "Good." We rode to Suren. I had a room prepared for her in the east wing of the hold, the wing that faced the river, with windows that opened on the water and let in the morning light. Not the guest quarters that visiting dignitaries used, which were formal and a little cold, but the older rooms that my family had used when Valdenmere was still governed from this building instead of the council hall. They were comfortable. They had good beds and river views and a bathroom with actual hot water, which I suspected she had not had access to in some days. My housekeeper, a practical woman named Sella who had been running the hold's domestic operations for 12 years, and who was entirely incapable of being surprised by anything, showed her to the room with the same efficient warmth she applied to everything. I heard Lissa's quiet voice in the corridor, thanking Sella, asking some question about the hot water, and the warmth in my wrist was steady and sure. I gave her 2 hours. I spent those 2 hours in my study doing the work that had stacked up in my absence, the overnight correspondence, the border settlement flood update, a note from my Eastern Garrison commander about a patrol roster issue, and trying to think clearly about what I was going to say to the council at noon and what I was going to say to her before that. The council problem was the simpler one in a way. I knew exactly what I was going to do with the council. I had decided in the marsh. The conversation with her was something I had been composing and discarding for 3 years, across the cold distance of a search I had not known how to end. Now that the ending had arrived, it did not feel like something that could be scripted. At the 2-hour mark, I went to the east wing. I knocked. "Come in," she said. She was at the window, standing in the morning light with a cup of something warm, tea or river herb, from the smell, and she had changed into clean clothes, a simple dress in the dark gray that seemed to be her default, her hair still damp from the bath. She looked like herself. That was the only way I knew how to put it, 3 years of searching, and now she was standing at my window looking exactly like herself. "Sit down," I said, "please." She turned from the window and looked at me with that direct, measuring gaze that I was beginning to recognize as simply her. The way she encountered everything, with her full attention and without pretense. She said. I said. "You wanted to explain," she said. "I wanted to explain," I said, "and I wanted to ask you something, but the explanation first." I told her everything in the order it happened. The morning on the dock, the mark appearing, the 40-second glimpse and then the empty south dock, the 3 years of careful, methodical searching, the inquiries, the narrowed list, the confirmed sighting that had arrived 8 days too late, the border council session, the council's refusal, Darrow and the gray boat and the marsh by night. She listened without interrupting. She was a good listener, the kind who actually listened rather than waiting for a pause to speak, who tracked a story with her whole attention and whose silence had texture rather than absence. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "You could have sent soldiers," she said. "The council refused authorization," I said. "Soldiers would have been an act of war." "You're the Alpha King," she said. "You could have declared war." "Over one unclaimed traveling Omega," I said. "Yes, I would have." She looked at me. There was something in her face that I could not quite name, not disbelief, but something adjacent to it. The expression of a person encountering an idea that conflicts with an assumption, so deep they had stopped noticing it was an assumption. No one has ever, she began and stopped. Called you someone's concern, I said. A pause, yes, she said. You are mine, I said, and then immediately, I want to be clear about what I mean by that, not as a possession. Not as a thing to be claimed in the way the Delta councils think about claiming. The bond is not, it's not a claim of ownership, it's a recognition. It's the oldest kind of recognition there is in the Wolf bloodlines. And it is, I believe, entirely mutual, even if one of us didn't know what it was for 3 years. She looked at her palm. The scar was quiet now. The blazing had faded back to its baseline, the low, warm glow that was apparently its resting state, the burn she had been carrying for 3 years without knowing why. I thought I was losing my mind, she said quietly. The first year especially, I kept examining my palm. I asked the guild healers about it. They told me it was probably a contact reaction to something river-grown. She almost smiled. I eventually stopped asking. It's the mate bond's answering mark, I said. On your palm because you're the receiving half of the bond, on my wrist because I'm the one who felt it first. In the old texts they describe it as I stopped, because I was about to cite the old texts at her and this was not, I was fairly certain, the moment for scholarship. She looked up at me with something that might have been amusement, which was not what I had expected. I know the old texts, she said. My mother kept a copy. She believed in them more than most. A pause. She also told me once that the mate mark, when it appears, is not something that can be argued with. She said the only choice is whether you walk toward it or away from it. What did she think about the right answer? I said. She thought it was obvious, she said, and then more quietly, I think so too. The warmth in my wrist was very steady. I said I wanted to ask you something, I said. Ask, she said. I would like you to stay, I said, in Seren, not under any obligation, not as a guest who is waiting to leave, not as a problem to be managed or a diplomatic arrangement to be sorted. As yourself, as the woman the bond found in a river market 3 years ago. I want the conversation I should have had on that dock, and I want to have it here where there's time for it, and I want to know you the way I've been. I stopped again. The way you've been searching to know me, she said. Yes, I said. She looked at me for a long time. Outside the window the Seren River moved in the morning light, amber and slow, the reed boats crossing in the early traffic. The hold was waking up around us, voices in the lower corridor, the kitchen beginning its work, somewhere below us a door opening and closing with the purposeful rhythm of a building with things to do. I have a circuit, she said, the traveling route. The settlements wait for the healers to come through. I know, I said. We have a permanent healer post in Seren that has been understaffed for 2 years, and the South Bank settlements can be served from here on a schedule, not a circuit, a route that comes home, if you wanted that. She looked at her palm again, then at me. You've thought about this, she said. For 3 years, I said, I have thought about very little else. She was quiet, not withdrawing. I was learning already to read the texture of her silences, the thinking ones from the shutting down ones, and this was the thinking kind. All right, she said at last. Yes, I'll stay. The mark on my wrist blazed once, warm and sudden and certain, and then settled back to its steady glow. And I thought that was probably the closest to celebration that a 3-year-old mate bond was capable of, and I found I did not mind. Thank you, I said. The question you asked, she said. You said you wanted to ask me something and then you asked if I'd stay. Was that it, or was there something else? I considered this. There was something else, I said. But it can wait. She looked at me with the measuring gaze. It was going to be, I tried to find the words that did not make it sound either presumptuous or inadequate. 3 years ago on that dock, I turned away for half a second, and I have spent the time since in the particular hell of knowing that if I had simply not turned, if I had simply spoken first, none of the rest of it would have been necessary. What I wanted to ask, I stopped. Ask, she said again. If I may, I said, sit with you for an hour, not to manage or to solve or to arrange anything further, just sit, on the side of that window where the river is, and talk or not talk as seems right. She was quiet for a moment. Then she moved along the window bench, making room. I sat beside her. The river moved below us in the morning light. The amber lanterns on the dock were still burning even in daylight, the river market finding its rhythm, the flat-bottomed skiffs crossing in the early traffic. Somewhere in the city a bell marked the morning hour. She had her cup of herb tea and her direct, unhurried attention, and 3 years of a burning scar she had not understood, and I had the same 3 years and a mark that was warm and steady and entirely, at last, at rest. We sat. The noon council was not the most comfortable meeting I had ever presided over, which was saying something, given that I had once presided over a border negotiation that had ended with 2 of the 7 delegates leaving through different doors, in order to avoid being in the same corridor. I brought Lissa. This was not standard practice. Observing parties at the Border Council needed formal status, which she did not yet technically have. The mate bond was real, and the mark was real, and anyone with wolf blood and a functioning nervous system could feel the pull of it in the room, but formal recognition in the Delta's legal framework required a mating ceremony, which we had not yet had. I brought her anyway. She stood at the side of the room, composed, her traveling pack at her feet because she had not yet moved it to her room. She was still, I suspected, holding some residue of uncertainty about whether she was truly staying, the reasonable caution of a woman who had been no one's concern for a long time. Parath sat across the table from me with his carefully neutral face, and his careful posture, and the particular quality of a man who has decided that the only survivable path through the next hour is to pretend that nothing unusual has happened. I let him open. He expressed, on behalf of the Dreven Council, deep concern about reports of an unauthorized crossing of the eastern border. He expressed confidence that such reports, if accurate, would be addressed through the appropriate diplomatic channels. He expressed hope that this meeting could resolve the matter to everyone's satisfaction, which I understood to mean to his satisfaction, specifically in the form of me agreeing that nothing had happened. I let him finish. Then I put my right arm on the table, inner wrist up, so the mate mark was visible to everyone in the room. The Delta Branch pattern was unmistakable. 14 years I had sat at this table and worn long sleeves or turned my wrist down out of habit, because a ruling alpha's unmatched mate mark was considered in the old tradition a private matter, not a shame exactly, but a vulnerability. The other representatives had known I was unmatched. They had not known about the mark. They knew now. Every wolf in the room felt it. That particular stillness, the kind that comes over a council chamber when the thing that has been in the room but unacknowledged suddenly becomes undeniable. Parath's carefully neutral face shifted, fractionally. Not much, but enough. 3 years ago, I said, the mate bond appeared on my wrist at Seren's River Market. The answering mark appeared simultaneously on the palm of an unclaimed traveling Omega named Lissa, a guild-registered healer with full rights of transit under the Interkingdom Accord. I did not gesture toward her. I did not need to. Every wolf in the room was already aware of her presence the way you're aware of a lamp in a dark room. 11 days ago, she was detained in the Dreven Eastern Compound. Yesterday, the Council declined to authorize her recovery under Section 9 of the Accord. I looked at Parath. I recovered her personally. Silence. The mate mark, I said, has been verified by both parties. The bond is real. The woman in question is my fated mate under every provision of wolf law and Delta custom that this Council recognizes. I looked around the table. I am informing the Council of this fact not because I require your authorization, The bond exists regardless of any council's decision, but because I want the record to be clear about what this council chose when it had the opportunity to act, and what became necessary as a result. The 5 neutral kingdom representatives were very still. 2 of them were looking at the mark on my wrist with the expression of men who are rapidly revising something. Parith was looking at me. The Dreven, he said carefully, wish to express their regret at any procedural confusion that may have arisen. The procedural confusion, I said, equally carefully, resulted in a guild-registered free mover being held without authorization for 11 days while the council discussed jurisdictional gray zones. I suggest that the Dreven's expression of regret be formalized in writing, directed to the council secretary, and that the council amend the gray zone language in Section 9 within the quarter to prevent future procedural confusion. I will be submitting the specific amendment language by the end of this week. Parith looked at the table, then slowly he nodded. The other 5 representatives were already nodding, with the slightly overeager energy of people who have concluded that the right position is the one that puts the most distance between themselves and Parith. The council secretary was writing rapidly. I looked at Lissa. She was standing at the side of the room with her pack at her feet and her hands quiet, and her direct gaze on the table, not on me, not on the council, but on the middle distance with the expression of a woman who is absorbing something she has not yet finished processing. The mark on her palm was not visible from where she stood, but I knew it was there, the mirror of mine, burning steady and certain. I stood. The record will note, I said for the secretary, that Lissa of the River Guild is recognized as the Alpha King of Valdenmir's fated mate under the Delta Wolf Law provisions, effective from the date of the bond's appearance, 3 years past. Her status in Valdenmir is not that of a guest, not that of an unclaimed traveling independent, and not that of a matter requiring anyone's consideration before it is accorded. She is the Alpha's mate. The mark is the authority. The secretary wrote. The council representatives looked at their tables, or at the mark on my wrist, or at the middle distance. None of them looked at Parith. I picked up the papers in front of me, gathered them with the habit of a man who has been running meetings for 14 years and does not leave a mess, and walked to where Lissa was standing. She looked up at me. "Is it done?" she said quietly. "The formal part," I said. "The rest will take a week in some bureaucratic correspondence." She looked at the council table, at the 7 men who had yesterday been the boundary around what she was worth in the Delta's accounting, and who were today very carefully not looking at her. "They declined," she said, "yesterday." "They did," I said. "And now they're sitting there," she said. "They are." She was quiet for a moment. "I was in that room for 11 days," she said. "No one came. The guild sent an inquiry and the inquiry was declined. The guards told me my documentation was insufficient. I kept asking about the accord." A pause. "They kept explaining jurisdictional gray zones." "They will not explain it again," I said. "Not to you, not to anyone else." She looked at me. The measuring gaze, but warmer now, something in it that had not been there before, or perhaps that had been there from the beginning, and I was only now learning to see it. The way the bond was not a new thing but an always thing that had finally been acknowledged. "All right," she said. We walked out. The mating ceremony was 3 weeks later, in the old Holds River Terrace, the outdoor terrace that overlooked the Seren water from the east side of the building, the one my family had used for generations when they wanted something to feel true rather than official. Not the council hall, not the formal throne room. The river terrace, in the late afternoon light when the Valdenmir water turned its particular color between gold and amber, the reed boats moving on the far current, the marsh birds quieting for the evening. Darrow was there, Sella was there. The East Wing staff who had made the rooms ready, the harbor master who had called my name that morning 3 years ago and set this particular chain of events in motion. I had told him this story recently, and he had turned a remarkable color and apologized, which I had told him was completely unnecessary, and which he had not entirely believed. The River Guild representatives were there, which mattered. The Guild's recognition was more meaningful to Lissa than any councils. The full Border Council had not been invited. This was not an oversight. The old Wolflaw mate bonding right was not complicated. Two people, the marks. The words that were spoken, which in the old tradition were not prescribed, you chose your own, and the seal, which was the marks being shown to the witnesses so the bond was no longer private but declared. No officiant required. The Wolflaw had always assumed that the bond itself was the authority, everything else was ceremony. I had thought about what I was going to say for 23 days, and I had not, in that time, produced anything that felt adequate to what I was trying to say. I had finally concluded that adequacy was not achievable, and that honesty was a better target. We stood facing each other on the river terrace in the late gold light. "I want to tell you what I know," I said. It was quieter than I had expected. The terrace held sound differently than the council hall. "I know that you have been moving through the Delta for 5 years as though you had no right to be still. I know that the world's accounting of your worth has been, by any measure I can apply, incorrect. I know that a mate bond is not a sentence, it's a recognition. It's the oldest form of being seen that the wolf bloodlines know." I looked at her. "I know that you are the person I turned away from on a dock for half a second 3 years ago, and that every single day since then has been the consequence of that half second, and that I would cross that marsh 100 more times without hesitation, without calculation, without asking anyone's permission." A pause. "I know that's a large thing to say to someone I have known for 3 weeks. 23 days, she said. 23 days, I said. "I've been counting too," she said. "I've been thinking about what I know." She looked at her palm, the Delta branch pattern glowing warm in the afternoon light. "I know that I have been explaining this mark to myself incorrectly for 3 years. I know that the things I was told about myself, that I was no one's concern, that unclaimed traveling independents were a category that didn't warrant consideration. I believed them more than I should have. Not fully, but enough to be surprised when someone did not." She looked up at me. "I know that when you came through that door in the Dreven compound, what I felt was not fear. And I know that what I feel now is," she stopped, considered. "Not surprising exactly, more like recognition. The way the mark felt from the first day, like something that was always there, finally being named." The river moved below the terrace. The late light moved on the water. Darrow was standing at the railing with his arms folded and the expression of a man who was very carefully not looking like he had feelings about any of this. I held out my wrist. She placed her palm against it. The marks blazed. Not the single sharp flame of the first recognition in the Dreven room, that had been the bond registering its own confirmation, the sudden light of two halves finding each other across a dark space. This was different, warmer. The warmth of a fire that has found its hearth, something that blazed because it was settling, not because it was discovering. The Delta branch patterns aligned, her palm to my wrist, the river tributary lines matching the way they always had to match because they were the same mark read from 2 sides. The witnesses saw it. The guild representatives leaned forward slightly. Sella made a sound that was brief and controlled and entirely characteristic of a woman who had decided 12 years ago that this hold was as close to a home as she was going to get, and who therefore had opinions about who made it into the inner rooms. "The bond is declared," Darrow said. He had a carrying voice from decades of giving orders, and he used it now with the particular quality of a man doing something that mattered. "Witnessed and recorded." "Witnessed and recorded," the guild representatives confirmed. Lissa looked at our joined hands, her palm my wrist, the twin marks glowing in the amber light. "Still surprising," she said quietly to me only, "even knowing what it is." "Yes," I said. She looked up at me. The direct gaze, the careful attention, the warmth that had been there from the first morning on the terrace, and that I was learning slowly to read in full. 3 weeks and 3 years and the delta between them. The distance of a half-second on a dock. The distance of a marsh crossing at midnight. The distance of 11 days in a driven holding room that should never have happened and would not happen again. "You said there was something else," she said. 23 days ago, in the East Wing room. You said you had a question and that it could wait." "I said it could wait," I said. "It's waited," she said. I looked at her. At the mark, at the river, at the late gold light on the water below us and the reed boats, and the Seren city moving through its evening, and all of it arranged around this moment, this terrace, this woman who had spent 5 years moving through the delta believing she was no one's concern. "I was going to ask," I said, "whether you could forgive me for turning away on that dock." She was quiet for a moment. "You turned for half a second," she said, "because your harbor master called your name, because a ship was going to clip the moorings." "Yes," I said. "That's not something that requires forgiveness," she said. "It has required 3 years," I said. "Of yours," she said, "and mine. We were both in the same mess," she considered, "although yours had more paperwork." "Considerably more paperwork," I agreed. She almost smiled. It was the first full smile I had seen from her, not the careful, partial ones, not the measuring warmth, but something real and unguarded, and it was, I thought, the most accurate thing I had seen in 3 years of searching. "Ask me again," she said, "in a year." "Ask you what?" "If I forgive you," she said, "ask me then after the year." "Why?" "Because," she said, "I think by then we'll both find it a strange question." She looked at the river. "And because I'd like a year first." The mark on my wrist was warm and steady and entirely at rest. The river moved below us. The city of Seren was going into its evening. The lanterns coming on at the dock. The reed boats making their last crossings. The amber light on the water deepening toward the particular dark that came before the stars appeared over the delta. "A year," I said. "At least," she said. She was right, of course. About all of it, the strange question it would become, the year being a beginning rather than an end, the way recognition, when it finally came to rest, stopped feeling like an event and started feeling like a state of being. The morning she had stepped off a skiff and walked into my market with her wicker basket and her gray cloak and the quiet, unassuming certainty of a woman who knew her craft, the bond had written itself into both of us without asking our permission. The asking came after. The knowing came after. Everything worth having came after. The Border Council had called her no one's concern. The mate mark had made fools of them before I could. And now she stood on the river terrace in the amber evening light with her palm still warm against my wrist, watching the Seren water move through the city that was, now, as much hers as mine, the city that had watched her pass through once and not known what it was seeing, and that would not make that mistake again. I did not have the words for what 3 years of searching felt like when it ended, standing on a terrace with a woman who had been burning with the same mark and not knowing its name. I had tried to find them in 23 days and had not managed it. What I had instead was the mark, and her hand, and the river, and the particular quality of an evening settling into the end of something that had been going on long enough. That would do. That was, in fact, everything.